Nissan Nation! From all things Nissan here in Middle Tennessee to wherever you watch us on YouTube, this is your Nissan Nation podcast, and I'm your host, David Boyd. So we wanted to get into the brand a little deeper. We obviously, we cover the brand pretty good with all the new stuff, but Nissan is full of heritage. There is a ton of cars to talk about in the past, and some made it till now, and some never, got past a year or two. So we wanted to break this down a little bit and get into this. So what we are going to do, this is going to be a series we're creating where we break down time periods. So today we are going to talk about the 80s. And you're like, well, that's cool. And it's like I said, this is the time period that I came into the Nissan brand as a consumer, and I feel like it's really the time period that Nissan came alive in America. They were throwing darts at a few things. They had a few cars in the 60s, 70s that, they're little trucks that were super, fuel efficient, but couldn't haul much. But they were little, nice little trucks. So you got the 240, 260, 280Zs in the 70s. But as far as that Nissan's really push and sometimes mess ups, the 80s is where it all starts. So we'll break into it a little bit. So as you know, in America, we were called Datsun for a while, and it for some reason, like, it just never, the Datsun name just never took as well as Nissan had hoped. And so they decided, hey, if we're going to push hard into the North American market, we just need to be called Nissan. So that's what happened. They changed the name, and it was quite confusing because you have about a year and a half time period where there's some cars that were still called Datsun, some were called Datsun Nissans, and then they just sort of trickled into Nissan. And there was all kinds of, in magazines and stuff, they pushed it a little bit, but it was still a little confusing for the, the U.S. buyer of what is this car brand? Because at the time, you had a bunch of, you had Toyota, and Nissan, Isuzu. You had a lot of different brands pushing into the market. So if you're kind of new, and I say new as relative, the 20 years or so, really pushing to get into the market, you need a name that sticks. And so they decided to go with Nissan. So some of these cars we're about to talk about, you're going to hear me call them Datsuns or Nissans. So let's get into the first one. The 720 pickup. And you're like, okay, which one is that one? Because it is confusing, because they like to change. They were doing a number system. And it does get slightly confusing. But in 1979, well, 79 and a half, they decided to switch from the 620 to the 720 pickup. And with this, they ditched the round lights. They did more of a square lights, more kind of a futuristic, what a lot of 80s cars were known for. They all started getting real sharp brakes in the body lines, and Nissan was, they were with the trend, so they went to the two square lights in the truck. And they upped the truck a little bit. Of course, every time you do a truck, you try to improve over the last one, and the 720 was no exception. So let's look into the numbers. So the 720 in the US, and that's where I'm only breaking this down to the US market. So it came with a whopping 97 horsepower motor. 97 horsepower, and you're like, wow. That's actually was pretty good for the time when GM and them were just breaking the 200 horsepower barrier for their full-size vehicles. You got a small truck that was, basically a smaller version of it. As you can see, they made it a little more modern than the previous version. Obviously, the front square headlights, the newer style grille. Very plain truck still, because that was what the import models were known for. They were known for just, it was a budget vehicle, and this truck makes no exception. But, there was optional radios, air conditioning, stuff like that. Of course, you're still in the carbureted engine, which most of you don't realize the pain in the butt carbureted motors were. They worked great when they worked. When they didn't, it just was a disaster. So, we were starting to get into the fuel injection, but that was going to be a couple years down the road. Nissan was at the forefront of offering king cabs. Now, in other regions, they offered full crew cabs, but in the States, sadly, we did not get that just yet. But they were bringing it, as you know, down the road. Colors, they did some exciting things. They did some 4x4 branding down the sides, kind of bringing over some of the 70s colors in the early 80s, and then they just went into the kind of basic white, black, vehicles into the mid 80s. But the 720 was pretty cool. It initially was imported in, and then in 1983, the Smyrna manufacturing plant here in Tennessee started building this truck. They built it for 3 years till we got into the hard bodies. I remember seeing these trucks everywhere, especially here in Middle Tennessee. Like they were just everywhere, and to this day you can still find them, barn finds, stuff like that. And if I can ever get my hands on one, I'm gonna build a little rat rod out of one. But that's for another show. So let's get into our next vehicle. So if you know body codes of Nissan, you're really gonna know this one, Z31, or the 300ZX as we like to call it. The 300 was kind of a departure for Nissan. They were going away from the straight six. They were getting into a new 3-liter they developed, a 3-liter that they would use for many vehicles on down the line. But this one was unique because they took the 280 and started streamlining a little bit. You know, aerodynamics is starting to kind of play into this. You got these big round lights that capture a lot of air on the 280, and you need to start get away from the drag of all that. So big thing in the 80s, square lights. You got to have those square lights, right? And you got to have pop-up lights because it wasn't enough that the Vet and all these other cars were starting to go to pop-up lights, which made them really look unique. You know, you had GM had the Firebird that had pop-up lights. So it was a big thing. Oh, we got to have square lights that every other cool car had, and you got to have pop-up lights, and the Z was no different. The 3-liter, the VG30DE engine, which I said that engine, it basically went even all the way down to the Xterra and the Frontier down the road, where they just added a little bit to the liters of it. But you could get it in a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic, and you're like, 4-speed automatic? In the days of 9 speeds? Yeah, I mean, that was groundbreaking. Back when that car would have been in the 240, 260, 280s, it probably was a 3-speed automatic. And so it was a big deal. Like, oh man, you're getting another gear. Much like the 9 speeds are of today, it was like, you know, the smoother it can transition, you know, you don't lose as much power. There's not that bump where you're losing the power. So they got into this vehicle. It changed over the course of you know, the till 89, till they quit building this and went on to the Z32. But they made minor changes like Nissan used to do. Taillights changed, interior obviously changed slightly, but overall it was still trying to be a pretty affordable sports car. And when I say pretty affordable, I mean the price. This is in the 80s, so the prices of everything starts just jacking up in the 80s. You're bringing in more modern technology, fuel injection, all that added cost to the vehicles, and you know, it started bringing the price up to the Z itself. But they actually sold quite a few of this thing. So from 1983 to 1989, they sold 329,900 of these. That's globally, but that's a lot of these cars. And if you look at the time period, that's a relatively short time period. So it proved that the car was still a hit. And would it be a hit when it got down to the Z32 down the road? I think you know, Nissan for the Z, I think the 70s is where they really made their ground with this car. But I think this car kept them in the limelight in the 80s of being, you know, we can still compete with your Vets and everything else, and still be a more affordable version of that. So being one of the cars of the 80s, I think you can't have a Nissan Datsun product in the 80s without mentioning the Z. So this next vehicle should be no surprise to you, the Nissan Pathfinder. And at the time in the 80s, Nissan didn't have anything that was super rugged and that you'd want to kind of, you know, maybe go in the woods with or take your family on exploring. They really, I mean, you had the 720 and they were getting into the hard body, but as far as like taking 4 people or more, like they just didn't really offer much that was rugged. So Nissan developed the Pathfinder in September of 85. It came out as an 86 model. And this was really neat for Nissan. Anytime like they develop anything, they have to do it very streamlined, especially at the time. You got to think they were only making a couple vehicles here in the States, Sentra and a 720 / hardbody. So they needed to streamline any vehicles they brought in because they were paying a tax to import these vehicles in. So when you do that, you gotta be smart. So they took the hard body frame and basically they just put an SUV cab on it, and that was basically how the Pathfinder came to be. Now the initial Pathfinder was a 2-door. Now you don't see a ton of these 2-doors, though they did make it for almost 5 years. You don't see a ton of them out there. You see more of the 4-doors because people's were shifting. They were wanting to go to more, you know, Four doors are easier to get out. You know, you don't have to flip the seat up to get your kids or whoever in the back of it. Even though my heart is more for a Pathfinder, I love the two-door Pathfinder, and I wish Nissan would develop some two-door SUV again. Hint, hint, Xterra. But they tried out the four-door Pathfinder, and it seemed to sell very well. And they actually built this vehicle for quite a while. So let's see, from 86 model to all the way to 1995, this current Pathfinder, Gen 1 Pathfinder, was built. And over the years, they made changes and, you know, slight things to it. Like in 1990, they added the four doors to it. Even though Nissan was scared of the American buyers at the time, because you had Jeep, you had Chevrolet Blazer, the Ford Bronco. Everybody was going to a four-door vehicle. Nissan was a little scared. They're like, are people going to buy this? So they did something really unique that carried through to the last generation Xterra. They hid the rear door handles. And if you've ever wondered why they just didn't have the normal pull door handles like everybody else, it all goes back to the Pathfinder. They're like, well, people buy the four-door SUV. And so the whole Pathfinder four-door look, if you look at it compared to the two-door, it's very similar. The only thing they did, nothing about the body size changed about this vehicle to add another door to that. They shortened up the front door slightly, added a rear door, and boom, you've got your next vehicle. Front framing, nothing changed at all. And this was actually a hit for Nissan. They went through a couple engines. It had a four-cylinder, or once again, you had the 3-liter, the 3.0. And as we talked about with the Z, of course, Z gets turbos and all the high-performance stuff. This was Nissan's bread and butter engine anymore, the 3-liter V6, and they put it in everything. And I mean, they put that engine in everything, and for good reason. It was a good engine. It was a solid engine, very reliable engine, and it continued on. What did you think of the Pathfinder? I was a big fan of it. Obviously, they changed, the grilling and stuff changed through the years, but let us know in the comments below. So this next model is kind of near and dear to me. It was my introduction into the Nissan Datsun brand. It is known as the B11, and you may go, B11, which one is that one? That is the Sentra. Nissan brought the Sentra into our family in year 1982 is when they brought that to the States, and it's kind of interesting vehicle because we were coming out of the gas crunch of the 70s, and so fuel economy was still in everybody's mind, and of course the imports were known for that. Coming from Japan, all these cars, like, they didn't have the resources, so fuel economy in Japan was everything. So it was important when they brought cars to the U.S. That was on everybody's mind. That's what really sparked the import market was fuel economy in these vehicles. It wasn't the Z or anything like that. It was when gas skyrocketed to over $1 a gallon, which today we're like, what? $1 a gallon. But yeah, when gas prices spiked, man, you needed everything you could get out of a car. And so Nissan had their little subcompact called the Sentra. And let's get into it a little bit. So the Sentra 82 to 86 was their first generation of this car, and it was the car that we had. I believe it was an 83 is the one we bought. And they were a no-thrills car. You got a radio, you might have got AC, and you got basically a 5-seater that was really a 4-seater. But it was a basic car. But the fuel economy in these things was ridiculous. So the 82 to 86 was rated at 43 city, 58 highway. And you're like, where are these numbers today? And you're like, well, it had a tiny, tiny little engine in it. It had let's get into it. It had a little 1.5, 1.6, or 1.7 diesel in this thing. And you're like, a diesel? Every fanboy of the trucks wants a diesel. Yeah, in the 80s, like, a lot of people were tinkering with diesels a little bit. And though they weren't as reliable as they are today, there was a market for them, and Nissan actually made a diesel Sentra. Now, go find one, because they're probably nearly impossible to find because they didn't sell very many of them. But Nissan had the Sentra. You could get it in a 2-door or a 4-door. Like I said, once again, it was a no-thrills car. It did what it was supposed to. Basically, it was a commuter car, a little subcompact car at the time, and it got you from point A to point B. And I did it super efficiently. It wasn't exciting to look at. Once again, you had square lights instead of round lights. This is where the Sentra really kicked off with the B12. It was a little bit bigger car, not much bigger, but you got a little more room, and they started actually putting a little more into these vehicles. The build quality was much better. They started manufacturing this car in the States, so which was nice. You didn't have to pay the import fees. So, and you could get one of these cars for $4 to $6 grand. And I think I would buy a car right now at $4 to $6 in a heartbeat, a new car. But it was very easy on your wallet. And was it exactly the most fun car to drive? No. But when you get to the 90s, those Sentras Nissan had a little surprise for us in the 90s. So now the last car on my list may not be one of yours, but it's very interesting to me because as everybody of fanboys of the Skyline and all those cars, everybody wants those cars, and it's what we can't have here. But this next one we could actually have, and many people don't realize that the 200SX was also known as the Silvia. Now we had a version of this car from 75 to 79, kind of a bloated version, big, kind of ugly car in my opinion. But by the 80s, by 79, they brought out what they called the S110, and it's where the car started kind of getting a little smaller, more refined, and obviously. Once again, it's the 80s. We got to have two square headlights, right? So Nissan got into that. The fun of this car, though, is it kind of competed in the Z area, but it didn't because it was a little bit smaller and a little wider than the Z, but it was a rear-wheel drive car that had some get up and go. So let's get into it. So the S110 two-door coupe or a three-door hatch. Now, the Celica and everybody at the time, which this car competed with, three-door hatches were kind of a popular thing. Volkswagen, everybody did a little three-door hatch. But this one was cool because it had some horsepower. So by the S12, which you got pop-up lights now. Once again, we've got to compete. We got to have pop-up square lights, right? But you could get an option, the 3-liter that I've talked about over and over in this, you could get that making 160 horsepower in this little thing. Now, for whatever reason, this car just never caught on much in the States. Now, as known as the Silvia everywhere else, the car is super popular. And, of course, we got it into the 90s, which was probably the peak of it. But in the 80s, the car is sold well, but just why it got a next generation here in the States based on what it did in the 80s, I'm not sure. But the 200SX was personally one of my favorites. I had a Hot Wheels of it when I was a kid. It was my favorite Hot Wheels that I had. And it was just very unique compared to everything else. Of course, it competed with the Celica, but it just looked a little longer. I don't know, something about the body lines. And then when they went to the pop-up headlights and they did some nice colors with the car, it just, something about that car resonated with me, even though I've never owned one. I'm always on the lookout, but finding them that aren't rusted to pieces is here in the States is kind of a nightmare. But I think it deserves to be on the list of the top 5 cars that Nissan brought to the States. Ultimately, yeah, they did it in the 90s where, like, once again, if you're a tuner guy, that's the cars you want. But for me, if you're going to talk about the 80s, you cannot describe a Nissan car without being, the 200SX. I just think that it was, for everything the Z did for, trying to go high performance, the 200, it was more of a modern, kind of more affordable car. So, once again, let us know what you think in the comments below. And what is your top 5 cars that you would say of the 80s? I know a lot of my fanboys of Maxima go, hey, why is Maxima not on this list? And to me, Maxima just, it wasn't there yet. It wasn't until the 90s that the Maximas, started really, really gaining ground, because Nissan had they had a bunch of kind of 4-door cars that just never took off in the 80s. So I think that, I think Maxima deserves to be in our 90s list maybe. But once again, let us know what you think in the comments below. Are these cars some of your favorites of the 80s? And if not, once again, let me know in the comments below of what you think. And if you haven't liked and subscribed to this yet, please like and subscribe what we do. It means a lot. We're on our goal of 1,000 subs, and we're going to do it hopefully in less than a year. So I appreciate everybody that's jumped in and subscribed already. But when you hit that like button, it keeps pushing us up in the analytics. And so I appreciate everything you guys have done for us. So, from all things Nissan here in Middle Tennessee to wherever you're watching us on YouTube, this has been your Nissan Nation podcast, and we've been talking 80s Nissan Datsuns. Peace.
appreciate this. So, for the